Washington was greeted at Riverdale Prison with a familiar smell, a mixture of disinfectant, sweat, and hopelessness. The 47-year-old investigator passed through 3 checkpoints without even noticing the humiliating search procedure. He'd visited enough correctional facilities in his 20 years on the force to accept it as routine. "Lucky you, Detective," the guard grinned, handing him back his badge. "It's only Monday morning and you've already got a dead body." Washington didn't answer. He'd learned to ignore the black humor that was an inevitable part of working with violence and death. The guard shrugged and nodded toward the hallway. "Dating room number 4, Warden Hawkins is waiting." The corridor seemed endless, reflecting fluorescent light off the gray-green walls. From behind the metal cell doors came the muffled sounds of prison life, conversations, radios, sometimes shouts. But Washington heard only his own footsteps and the quiet jingling of the handcuffs on his belt. The smell of blood hit his nostrils before the detective even crossed the threshold of the visiting room. The guard standing at the door looked indifferently at the entrance and made a note in the logbook. "The police arrived at 9 o'clock and 15 minutes, he said mechanically. Washington nodded and took a deep breath before entering. Not that the sight of a corpse would faze him. He'd long ago stopped reacting to dead bodies. But it took a moment each time to put on his usual mask of professionalism. The visiting room was small, a table, 4 chairs, 1 barred window under the ceiling. There were too many people in it now, 2 forensic technicians, a photographer, a medical examiner leaning over the body, and a tall man in an expensive suit that looked out of place against the institutional walls. "Detective Washington," the man held out his hand. "Dexter Hawkins, warden." Washington shook the dry, manicured palm and noted that Hawkins, a 55-year-old administrator with a military bearing, was trying to stay away from the pool of blood on the floor. "What's your emergency?" Washington asked, though the answer was obvious. The body of a young black woman lay against the wall, partially hidden by the examiner leaning over her. Even so, it could be seen that her throat had been slit with such force that the knife had probably reached her spine. Blood poured down the front of her modest dress and formed a dark puddle on the concrete floor. Blood spatter covered the nearest wall and a part of the table. "A Kiara Jackson, 33 years old," Hawkins answered, with a perfectly rehearsed look of regret on her face. "Arrived for a scheduled visit with her husband, Tavin McKinley, at 8 hours and 30 minutes this morning. At 8 hours and 55 minutes, our staff heard screaming and burst into the room. McKinley was holding a homemade knife, and his wife was already dead." "A homemade knife?" Washington raised an eyebrow. In a maximum security prison, Hawkins pressed his lips together. "Unfortunately, even the best security systems aren't perfect, Detective. The inmates are extremely resourceful when it comes to weapons." Washington stepped closer to the body. The medical examiner, a full African-American man with graying temples, stepped back, giving him a better view. "Multiple stab wounds to the neck and upper chest," the examiner said. "The primary cause of death is carotid artery and jugular vein dissection. Death was almost instantaneous from massive blood loss. Time of death is consistent with witness statements. Approximately 9 a.m. Violence?" Washington asked, even though it was obvious. "No signs of sexual assault," the expert replied, grimacing. "But the murder is definitely violent. The assailant delivered at least 12 blows, many of them excessive. The victim was dead after the 2nd or 3rd. Washington nodded. "And the murder weapon?" Already bagged and sent to the lab, Hawkins interjected. "Classic homemade prison knife, sharpened from a metal plate with a cloth-wrapped handle. There's no doubt it was used to commit the murder. The knife was in McKinley's hand when the guards came in. And there's plenty of blood and prints on it." "I'd like to see the security footage," Washington said. "Of course," Hawkins nodded. "Let's go into my office." They went through several secured doors into the administration wing. On the way, Washington noticed a group of guards standing in the hallway with coffee in their hands. One of them, a tall white man with a military haircut, was gesturing inimitably. "I say another 25 years, no less." His voice reached the detective. "They'll lock him up for the maximum this time." "Nope," the other guard said. "Knowing our system, 15 at the most. These animals are killing each other, and we have overcrowded prisons." "I'll bet 20 on 20 years," laughed a third. Hawkins quickened his step, glaring at the guards who hadn't noticed the warden. The warden's office was unexpectedly spacious and well-furnished. An oak desk, a leather chair, diplomas on the walls. Hawkins sat down at his computer and manipulated the mouse for a few seconds. "Here," he said, turning the monitor toward the detective. A full recording of the incident. The video was crisp, black and white, no sound. The camera covered the entire visiting room from above. Washington saw Sierra Jackson sitting across from a large man in a prison robe. They talk, with no visible signs of tension. Then the woman pulls some paper out of her bag and shows it to the man. Tavon McKinley reads it, and his face suddenly contorts. He stands up abruptly, knocking over a chair. Sierra rises as well, retreating to the wall. A guard appears briefly in the frame, looking into the room through a window in the door, but does not enter. Tavon yells something, judging by the contorted face, then suddenly snatches something shiny from under his clothes and lunges at his wife. The first blow is to the neck, blood spatter visible even on the black and white footage. Sierra falls, but Tavon continues to strike with uncontrollable fury, even when the woman is no longer moving. Finally, 3 guards burst into the room, dragging Tavon away from the body and pawing his hands behind his back. "Why is there no sound?" Washington asked when the tape ended. Hawkins shrugged. "Technical malfunction. The microphones in this unit have been malfunctioning for a week. We ordered new ones, but you know how government procurement works." Washington rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Do you know what she showed him? What caused that reaction?" "I have no idea," Hawkins replied. The paper disappeared in the commotion. Maybe she told him about the divorce or the affair. You know how it is with prisoners' families? The detective looked closely at the warden. "How long have they been married?" "About 6 months," Hawkins said after a pause. "To be honest, I was surprised by this marriage. We've had McKinley here for 4 years, serving a 12-year sentence for armed robbery. All of a sudden, 6 months ago, this woman shows up and marries him. They didn't know each other before his incarceration, as far as I know. And that didn't alarm you?" Hawkins threw up his hands. "Detective, do you realize how many strange marriages are made to prisoners? Women falling in love with criminals? It's a well-known phenomenon. It's not for me to judge their motives." Washington nodded. "I want to talk to McKinley. He's in the holding cell under heavy guard," Hawkins said. "I can arrange an interrogation right now, but I gotta warn you, he hasn't said a word since he was taken into custody." Tavon McKinley sat at a table in the interrogation room, handcuffed to a metal ring. His eyes were blank, his gaze directed to a single point on the wall. Sierra's blood had dried in dark brown stains on his robe and hands. "Do you know who I am?" Washington asked, sitting down across from him. Tavon blinked, his eyes focused on the detective for a second, then back to the wall. "Mr. McKinley, I'm investigating the murder of your wife, Sierra Jackson," Washington continued. "The surveillance footage clearly shows that you were the one who fatally wounded her. The question now is not whether you are guilty, but why you did it." Tavon didn't react. His face remained a fixed mask, with only an occasional twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Do you realize you're facing life in prison?" The detective asked. "Or even the death penalty, depending on the prosecutor's decision. But if you cooperate, talk about your motives, show remorse, you have a chance for a lighter sentence." Silence. Tavon sat so still he looked like a statue. "What did she show you?" Washington leaned closer. "What was on that paper that made you so angry?" No reaction. "Mr. McKinley, you have children, don't you?" The detective changed tactics abruptly. This time there was a reaction, a subtle tensing of the shoulders, a subtle change in the eyes. Washington caught the moment. 2 children, if I'm not mistaken. A son and a daughter. They live with your mother. Would you ever want to see them? Taven remained silent for a few seconds. Then his lips quivered. She shouldn't have come here, he said so quietly that Washington barely heard him. Why not? Some doors are best kept closed, Taven said. And those were his last words. No matter how much the detective tried, the prisoner never uttered another sound. After the unsuccessful interrogation, Washington returned to the room where the murder had occurred. It was now empty. The body had been removed. Forensics had finished their work. The only traces of blood left were on the floor and walls, which the janitor was trying to clean up with bleach. The detective looked around the room. What really happened here? What could have caused such blind rage in a man who knew he was facing even more time? A simple murder of passion. But the marriage was only 6 months ago, when Taven was already in prison. That's weird. The janitor finished his work and walked out, leaving the detective alone. Washington walked slowly across the room, scrutinizing every corner. Something glinted under the desk. Leaning over, he saw a small earring, a simple silver ring with a turquoise stone. Sierra must have lost it during the attack. The detective pulled out a plastic evidence bag, carefully wrapped the earring, and put it in his pocket. The next item was to look through the victim's personal belongings. In a small storage room, the guard handed the detective Sierra's bag, a brown leather shoulder bag, now sealed in a plastic bag as evidence. "Sign here," the guard said monotonously, holding out a magazine. Washington took the bag and settled into the empty office he had been assigned to work in. Putting on gloves, he carefully opened the bag and began to examine the contents. A wallet with a small amount of cash, credit cards, and a driver's license keys to the apartment and car. A tube of lipstick, a mirror, tissues. And what caught the detective's eye? A journalist's ID card in the name of Sierra Jackson, an employee of the Metropolis Chronicle, a small but respected city newspaper known for its investigative reporting. Underneath the ID was an unmarked flash drive. Washington twirled it in his hands, then put it in a separate evidence bag. The computer experts at the station would sort out its contents. The bottom of the bag revealed a small leather-covered notebook. Flipping through the pages, the detective saw small, neat handwriting, dates, names. Many of the entries were in the form of short notes or ciphers, understood only by the author. But one entry, made on the last page 2 days ago, caught his attention. X gets 70% of the contraband, parcels through Z, money through K. The documents are almost ready. Meeting with T. Last chance to get confirmation. Washington closed the notebook thoughtfully. Sierra was a journalist working on some kind of investigation. This could explain her strange marriage to a prisoner. Perhaps it was a way to gain access to the prison. But what was she investigating? And what did it have to do with her murder? The detective returned to the warden's office. Hawkins looked tired, but still had impeccable posture. "Are you finished, detective?" he asked. "I have to prepare an official report for the Department of Corrections." "Not yet," Washington answered. "I need records of all of Sierra Jackson's previous visits to her husband, and if possible, records of their phone conversations." Hawkins frowned. "That's gonna take time, and possibly a court order." "I'll take care of the warrant," Washington nodded. "In the meantime, I'd like to talk to the other prisoners on McKinley's block. Someone might have heard something or know something." "Of course, detective," Hawkins replied, with a professional smile that didn't affect his eyes. "We all have an interest in seeing justice done, but let me give you a word of advice. Don't get your hopes up with the prisoners. It's not in their culture to cooperate with the authorities." Washington shrugged. "I'm still willing to give it a try." Leaving Hawkins' office, the detective headed for the prison exit. He needed to check out Sierra's apartment and talk to her co-workers at the newspaper. Something about this case wasn't adding up, and Washington felt that the murder in the visiting room was just the tip of the iceberg. The Lakewood neighborhood greeted Detective Washington with the usual pattern of disrepair: peeling paint on facades, broken windows, boarded-up doors of abandoned stores. Luttrell turned off the engine of the squad car and sat for a few minutes just watching the neighborhood through the windshield. Teenagers on the corner, pretending to just chat, but clearly watching the drug trade. Tired women carrying bags of groceries, men sitting on porches with cans of beer despite the early morning hours. The world from which Tavin McKinley had come to prison, and the world his family still lived in. Tavin's mother's house didn't stand out in any way. A 3-story brick house with shabby plaster and bars on the first-floor windows. The detective got out of the car immediately feeling the wary eyes on him. Outsiders weren't liked here, and cops were even less so. The door was opened by an elderly woman with a face riddled with wrinkles like dry earth with cracks. Clarice McKinley looked 70, though Washington knew from the case file that she was barely 58. "Mrs. McKinley?" the detective asked, showing his badge. "Detective Luttrell Washington, City Police. I'm investigating a case involving your son, Tavin." The woman nodded silently and stepped aside, letting him into the house. It was clean but poor inside, shabby furniture, an old TV, faded wallpaper. From the next room came children's voices and the sound of a cartoon. "Are the kids home?" Washington asked, sitting down in the offered chair. "Yes," Mrs. McKinley replied. "Jamal and Shanice, I didn't send them to school today. They don't know about Sierra's death yet." Her voice was calm, almost lifeless, like someone who had experienced so much grief that new shocks no longer evoked emotion. "Were you acquainted with Sierra Jackson?" the detective asked. "She came here a few times." The woman absently adjusted the napkin on the table. "Good girl, smart, not the type to get involved with guys like my Tavin." "When did you meet her?" "About 8 months ago," Mrs. McKinley replied. "She said she was writing an article on prison families. She interviewed me, took pictures of the kids. Then she started visiting Tavin in prison. 2 months later, she told me they were married." "Didn't that strike you as odd?" The woman shrugged. "In our world, detective, people don't ask too much." "Sierra was kind to the children, brought them gifts." Tavin in his letters seemed calmer. "I didn't ask questions." Washington nodded. He understood this philosophy of survival, not asking questions, accepting what is given, not demanding explanations. "Did Sierra ever talk about her job, about what she was investigating?" Mrs. McKinley shook her head, then stood up and walked over to a faded photograph on the wall. A young Tavin in a graduation cap, smiling broadly. "You know, detective, when Tavin was little, he wanted to be a lawyer," she said without turning around. "Smart kid," teachers praised him. "But here in Lakewood, dreams like that don't survive. The system isn't for people like us." She turned, and Washington saw not tears in her eyes, but a deep, frozen weariness. "So what happened?" she asked. "Why did Tavin kill her?" The detective shook his head. "That's what I'm trying to find out, Mrs. McKinley. Have you noticed anything unusual lately? Strange visitors, phone calls. There was a man here 2 weeks ago," she said after a pause. "He introduced himself as a social worker, said he was checking on the children's living conditions, but he had no ID, and when I asked, he left. She stopped talking. "And what?" Washington asked softly. "I saw him taking pictures of the house and the kids as they played in the yard." The detective made a note in his notebook. It could have been related to the case, or it could have been a routine check on living conditions. In neighborhoods like Lakewood, social services were often extra attentive to families. "One last question, Mrs. McKinley. Did Sierra have a place where she kept her work materials? Maybe she left some documents, thumb drives here?" The woman hesitated. "No, she always carried the bag with her. But she used our computer a couple times when her laptop broke. It's in the kids' room." An old desktop computer stood on a table in the corner of the kids' room. Jamal, a boy of about 8, and Shanice, a girl of about 6, watched curiously as the detective turned on the machine. "Are you a policeman?" the boy asked. "How's Daddy?" Washington looked at the child in surprise. "Is your daddy a policeman?" "No," the boy shook his head. "He's in jail. But Aunt Sierra said he helps the good cops catch the bad people inside so he can't come home." The detective felt something squeeze inside. The kids believed their father was an undercover hero. Chera's kind lie that was now cut short with her death. The computer booted up and Washington began checking. As he expected, there was nothing of interest on the hard drive. Sierra was a professional and unlikely to leave important material in such an accessible place. However, the browser history revealed visits to news sites and what caught the detective's attention: several search queries about corruption in the prison system and drug smuggling. "Thanks for your help," Washington said, shutting down the computer. "You've been very helpful to the investigation." Mrs. McKinley walked him to the door. "Detective," she called to him as he was coming down the steps, "what's going to happen to Tavern?" Washington paused. What could he tell this woman that her son would almost certainly get life in prison? That even if he proved the murder was provoked, the best Tavern could hope for was a reduced sentence? "I'll do everything I can to find out the truth," he replied. The Megapolis Chronicle was housed in an old building in the center of town. The sign above the entrance was in need of repair, as was the facade. But inside, it was bustling with life. Journalists at their computers, phones ringing, conversations buzzing. The editor-in-chief, a gray-haired man with tired eyes, met the detective in his cluttered office. "Marcus Williams," he introduced himself, shaking Washington's hand. "A terrible tragedy with Sierra. I can't believe she's gone." "How long had you known her?" the detective asked, declining the offered coffee. "Almost 5 years," Williams replied, sinking into the creaky chair. "She came to us straight out of university. Best investigative reporter I've ever known. Hard-working, meticulous, fearless. What had she been working on lately?" The editor sighed and opened a desk drawer, pulling out a folder. "Here's her latest project, an investigation into corruption in the prison system, specifically Riverdale Prison." The article was due out in a week. Washington took the folder and began looking through the materials, printouts of documents, photographs, interview notes. Gradually, a picture of a massive corruption scheme began to emerge before him. According to Sierra's investigation, the administration at Riverdale Prison, headed by Dexter Hawkins, had organized a system of supplying drugs to inmates, extorting money from their relatives for special conditions, and even forced labor in underground factories. "Did she have proof of any of this?" the detective asked, closing the folder. "She said that the most important proof she would get was at the last meeting with the informant in prison," Williams replied. "That was yesterday." Washington drummed his fingers on the table thoughtfully. Her marriage to inmate Tavin McKinley was part of the investigation. The editor nodded. Sierra had suggested the idea when she found it difficult to get information from inside the prison. "We argued for a long time. I thought it was too risky and unnecessary. But she insisted. She said it was impossible to gather enough evidence without regular access to the prison." "Did McKinley know the marriage was a sham?" "Not that I know of." Williams shook his head. "Sierra said he believed her story that she'd fallen in love with him during her first interview." The editor was quiet for a moment. "I know how that sounds, detective, using a man in that way, but Sierra was an idealist. She believed that the end justified the means. If that end was justice," Washington nodded. He didn't condemn Sierra's methods. Everyone did their job as they saw fit. But now he had a better understanding of what might have provoked Tavin to murder. To find out that the woman whose love you believed in was just using you for an article. For a man with pride and a wounded ego, it could be the last straw. "Can I get a copy of all the material?" the detective asked. Of course, Williams replied, but I must warn you. If you're going to continue investigating Ciara, be careful. The people she wrote about are powerful and will stop at nothing to keep their secrets. He was quiet for a moment. That's why I'm convinced her murder wasn't a simple outburst of anger by a prisoner. It was an assassination. Leaving the newsroom, Washington headed back to Riverdale Prison. A picture began to form in his mind. Ciara was close to exposing a corruption scheme, and someone was determined to stop her. But how exactly had Taven been provoked? What was he shown or told? At the prison, Washington was met with a less than welcoming reception. The guard at the entrance took a long look at his ID, then reluctantly let him through. Warden Hawkins wasn't there. The detective was told, but he'd left for a meeting at the Department of Corrections. I'd like to speak to your technician, Washington told the officer on duty. The one in charge of the video surveillance system, the officer reluctantly dialed an internal phone, and a few minutes later, a thin, nervous man of about 35 entered the room. Raymond Tucker, he introduced himself. What can I do for you, detective? I need to talk to you about the surveillance system, Washington said, specifically about the footage from visiting room 4 from yesterday morning. Tucker visibly tensed. I've already explained everything to Chief Hawkins. Technical problems with the sound system. We've ordered new microphones. Mr. Tucker, Washington interrupted him. Let's talk frankly. I checked the technical documentation of your video surveillance system. It was installed only 2 years ago at state-of-the-art equipment with separate video and audio recording systems. Even if there was a problem with the microphones, it doesn't explain why the sound is missing on this particular recording. Tucker turned pale and looked back nervously at the door. Detective, I can't. I have a family, a mortgage. I understand, Washington nodded. And I'm not asking you to risk your job. But this is a murder case. If you know something and you're hiding it, that's complicity. The technician ran his hand over his face. All right, he said quietly. But not here. Meet me after my shift, 6 p.m., at Donna's Cafe on 14th Street. Washington didn't press. He understood the man's fear of a system in which everyone was just a small cog. 6 o'clock at Donna's, the detective nodded. Back in the car, Washington found a message from Lieutenant Harris, his immediate superior. Get back to the station immediately. The lieutenant's office was already waiting for him. Harris, a heavy-set man with a face red from constant high blood pressure, sat behind a desk, and next to him was Assistant Prosecutor Jenkins, whom Washington knew from several previous cases. Here's our detective, Harris said as Washington entered. Sit down, Lathrell. What's the matter, Lieutenant? Washington asked, remaining standing. The thing is, Jenkins interjected, we've gotten all the files on the Riverdale prison murder. An open and shut case, Detective. Killer is known, motive is clear, witnesses are in, videotape is in. I'm preparing an indictment today. With respect, sir, Washington replied, but the investigation is not over. There is reason to believe that the murder was provoked and is part of an attempt to cover up corruption in the prison system. Harris and Jenkins exchanged glances. Detective, the ADA said patiently, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but we have an overburdened court system, overcrowded jails, and a line of cases waiting to be investigated. Why waste resources on a case that's already obvious? Because that's our job, Washington replied, getting to the truth, not just closing files. Look, Lathrell, Harris said tiredly, you're a good cop, one of the best. But you gotta understand how the system works. Tavon McKinley is a repeat offender serving time for armed robbery. He killed his wife in front of the cameras. It's an open and shut case. The DA's office wants to close the case quickly, and I understand. What about justice for Ciara Jackson? Washington asked. She was a journalist who investigated prison corruption. Her death may be connected to that investigation? Do you have evidence of that connection? Jenkins asked, raising an eyebrow. Washington was silent. He had suspicions, but not hard evidence for now. "I need 2 more days," he said. "If in 2 days I don't find evidence of another motive for murder, the case is closed." Harris and Jenkins looked at each other again. "One day," the lieutenant finally said, "you have 24 hours. After that, the case goes to trial." Leaving the office, Washington headed for the technical department. The flash drive found in Sierra's bag had already been analyzed. The technician, a young woman with brightly colored bracelets, handed him the report. "Most of the files are encrypted," she said, "but a few had been opened. These are pictures of documents, financial records from Riverdale Prison, with some strange discrepancies in the numbers, and a list of names with amounts against each one." Washington looked through the files. Names like Project R and Operation Bridge didn't tell him anything, but the amounts were impressive. Hundreds of thousands of dollars a month. Among the names on the list, he noticed Hawkins D. with the largest amount. "Thank you," he said to the technician. "Can you continue working on the encrypted files?" "Of course," she nodded, "but it'll take time. The encryption is serious." Washington glanced at his watch. Almost 6. It was time to meet Tucker. Donna's Cafe was a typical working-class diner. Plastic tables, cheap food, dim lights. Washington took a table in the corner which gave him a good view of the entrance and ordered a coffee. Tucker showed up at 6:30, looking even more nervous than he had during the day. He ordered a whiskey, took a swig, and only then looked at the detective. "I'm risking everything by talking to you," he said quietly. "I appreciate that," Washington replied, "and I promise to protect you if I have to." Tucker grinned bitterly. "You don't understand, detective. The system doesn't break, it works, exactly as it's designed to work." "Tell me about the tape," Washington directed him gently. The technician took a deep breath. The system was working fine. All the cameras and microphones were functioning perfectly. "After the incident, Hawkins called me in and ordered me to remove the soundtrack from the tape. Said it was a matter of national security, that some classified operation was in jeopardy." "And you believed him?" "No," Tucker shook his head. "But I believed I'd lose my job if I refused. I have 2 children, a sick mother. I can't afford principals." "Do you still have the original tape?" Washington asked. "It should be in the system archive," Tucker replied. "All records are automatically duplicated on the Department of Corrections server, but access to them is limited." "Does the prison have a copy?" Tucker hesitated. "Yes," he finally said, "on a backup server in the technical department. But it's in a secure room, not easy to get into." "What else can you tell us about the prison's surveillance system?" Washington asked. Tucker looked around, made sure no one was eavesdropping, and leaned closer. "There's one more thing. There are additional microphones in the visiting rooms that only Hawkins and a few of his cronies know about. They're not connected to the main system. Hawkins is using them to, information gathering." "Blackmail?" Washington clarified. "Exactly," Tucker nodded. "Prisoners and their relatives often talk about things that can be used against them. Hawkins collects these records and uses them to extort money or favors." The detective made a note in his notebook. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. "One last question, Mr. Tucker. Did you see or hear the original recording of the conversation between Sierra Jackson and Taven McKinley before the murder?" "No," the technician answered. "I only deleted the soundtrack on Hawkins's orders." "But," he hesitated. "But what?" Washington nudged him. "There was a guard in the room just before the murder. James Morrison. He said something to McKinley, and he immediately exploded. You can see it even on the tape without sound if you look closely." Washington nodded. He remembered that detail. The guard peering through the window of the door. But he hadn't paid much attention to it. "Thank you, Mr. Tucker," the detective said, standing up. "You've been very helpful to the investigation." "Detective!" the technician called out to him as Washington headed for the exit. "Be careful. Hawkins is not a man to mess with. He's got patrons upstairs." Washington nodded. He'd known for a long time that the system didn't work the way it was written in textbooks. That justice was a relative concept, especially when it came to power and money, but that didn't mean he should give up without a fight. Leaving the cafe, the detective pondered his next move. He had less than 24 hours to find the evidence that would make the system work the way it should. Evidence that would give justice to Sierra Jackson. The morning sun barely broke through the lattice windows of B Block at Riverdale Prison. Detective Lathro Washington walked down the long hallway, accompanied by a scowling guard. The inmates looked at them through the metal cell doors. Wary, appraising, blank. Everyone here had learned to hide their emotions, to show only the part of themselves that helped them survive. "Johnson is in interrogation room 3, the guard said, stopping at the gray metal door. "You have 15 minutes, no more. Warden Hawkins only authorized it because it's a murder case." Washington nodded. He'd had to get half the department on its feet in the middle of the night to get permission to meet with Zeke Johnson, the informant Tucker had mentioned. Time was running short, only a few hours before the case would be officially closed and brought to trial. In the small interrogation room, Zeke Johnson, a thin black man in his early 40s, sat at a table handcuffed to a brace embedded in the floor. His eyes were like those of a hunted animal, wary, frightened, but with a glimmer of cunning. "Mr. Johnson," Washington began, sitting down across from him, "I'm investigating the murder of Sierra Jackson." "I don't know anything," Johnson replied quickly. "Haven't seen anything? Haven't heard anything." The detective sighed. Classic inmate response. The walls had ears here, and any cooperation with the authorities could turn into a knife to the ribs in the shower room. "I know you're Hawkins' informant," Washington said quietly, leaning closer. "And I know about the blackmail system he set up. The drugs, the smuggling, the extortion of money from the families of the prisoners." Johnson's face didn't change, but his fingers began tapping nervously on the table. "Even if that's true, why would I talk to you? I mean, they'd kill me, because I can get you out of here," Washington replied. "Witness protection program. Transfer to another state. Reduced sentence, but only if you help me." Johnson laughed, but there was no mirth in his laugh, only bitterness. "You sound like her," he said. "Like Sierra. She too promised protection, a new life, freedom. And now she's dead." "Did you work with her?" Washington asked, trying not to show surprise. "For the last 3 months," Johnson nodded. "I've been feeding her information about Hawkins' schemes, names, dates, amounts. She paid for the information, not money, of course, but cigarettes, privileges for my brother, who's also in here." "And Hawkins found out about it?" Johnson wrinkled his nose as if in sudden pain. "A week ago. One of the guards noticed us exchanging notes while we were cleaning up. Hawkins called me into his office. His deputy Morrison and 2 other guards were waiting there. He fell silent, remembering. They showed me pictures of my brother in the shower room with a knife at his throat. Said if I didn't help them, he wouldn't live to see the morning." "And what did they want?" "For me to help them frame Sierra," Johnson replied. Hawkins knew that she had collected almost all the evidence except the main one, the secret microphone recordings that would prove his personal involvement. She needed to get into the technical bay where the recordings were kept, and she planned to use Tavon to help her. He had access to the laundry room, which is next to the tech bay. "And you agreed to help Hawkins?" "I had no choice," Johnson shrugged. "I had to convince Tavon that his wife was a traitor, that she only married him for the sake of the article, that she was actually laughing at him with his journalist friends. I knew it would make him angry, but I didn't think he'd kill her. I swear I didn't know." Washington eyed the informant carefully. He was telling the truth, or at least his version of the truth. What happened next? Hawkins prepared fake letters, supposedly from Sierra, to the editor, where she called Tavon a dumb animal who could be easily fooled. "I showed them to Tavon 2 days ago." He was calm on the outside, but I could see something breaking inside. Johnson sighed convulsively. And yesterday morning, before Sierra's visit, Morrison came to his cell. I don't know what he said, but after that, Taven was like a time bomb. "Where are those fake letters now?" the detective asked. "Tavon should have them in his cell if he didn't destroy them," Johnson replied. "But the main evidence is the microphone recording in the visiting room. It should be able to hear what Morrison said just before he was killed." Washington nodded. It matched what Tucker had said. "One last question, Mr. Johnson. Why was Hawkins so afraid of Sierra's investigation? Surely he must have protection upstairs." Johnson leaned even closer and lowered his voice to a whisper. "Because this isn't just smuggling and extortion. There's prisoner experimentation involved here. Hawkins is allowing some pharmaceutical company to test new drugs on D-Block prisoners in exchange for huge sums of money. Some of the test subjects died or went insane. Sierra had heard about it from the wife of one such prisoner and was going to include the information in her article." Washington felt a chill run down his spine. This isn't just corruption anymore, it's crimes against humanity. "Thank you for the information, Mr. Johnson," the detective said, standing up. "I'll keep my promise. If what you say checks out, I'll get you out of here." Exiting the interrogation room, Washington headed straight for the warden's office. A plan was already forming in his head. He knew that he would not be able to get access to the secret records in an official way. Too many influential people were interested in hiding the truth, so he would have to proceed in another way. Hawkins met him with a professional smile that didn't affect his eyes. "Detective Washington, what a surprise. I thought your investigation was complete. The DA already called me about taking the case to trial." "Almost done," Washington replied, sitting down in his chair uninvited. "But there are a few things I'd like to clear up." "Of course," Hawkins nodded. "I'm at your service. I need access to Taven McKinley's personal effects," the detective said, "and to the records of all phone conversations between him and Kiara Jackson in the last month." Hawkins frowned slightly. "That would require a warrant." "There is one," Washington interrupted him, pulling a paper from his inside jacket pocket. It was a real warrant, one of the few trump cards he'd been able to get thanks to his old connections in the judicial system. The warden scrutinized the document, then nodded. "All right, I'll make the arrangements. Anything else?" "Yes," Washington said, choosing his words carefully. "I hear you have an additional video surveillance system for internal security purposes." Hawkins' eyes flashed with surprise for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about, Detective." "I think you do," Washington replied, "and I think that the recording from this system may hold a clue to the motive for the murder. Specifically, I'm interested in what Morrison's security guard told Taven McKinley before he attacked his wife." Hawkins remained silent, examining the detective with renewed interest. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands on his stomach. "Listen, Washington, you seem like a smart man. Why complicate a simple case? A prisoner killed his wife in a fit of rage. It happens. He gets the punishment he deserves. Life goes on. Why dig deeper?" "Because it's my job," Washington said simply. "Your job is to enforce order," Hawkins parried, "to protect the system. And the system is set up so that everyone knows their place. Prisoners serve their sentences. Guards keep order. Administrators manage the process. When someone, a nosy journalist for example, tries to interfere, chaos ensues. The system should serve justice," Washington argued. "Punish the guilty. Protect the innocent." Hawkins laughed. "Those are beautiful words, Detective. But in reality, the system serves to maintain the status quo. The rich stay rich. The poor stay poor. The powerful make decisions, and everyone else obeys. And you know what? It works. We keep dangerous people out of society, give them a roof over their heads, 3 meals a day. In a way, it's even humane." Washington knew there was no point in arguing. Hawkins was a product of the system that had nurtured this twisted logic in him. "Just give me the warrant and the records," he said. Hawkins shook his head. "Okay, detective. But remember, sometimes walls have not only ears, but also long arms." It sounded like a threat. But Washington hadn't been afraid of threats in a long time. Tavon McKinley's cell was standard 6 square meters of concrete and metal. A bed, a toilet, a small table, a couple of books. There was no prisoner in it. He'd been moved to the holding cell after the murder. With Hawkins' permission, and under the supervision of 2 guards, Washington searched the cell thoroughly. In the mattress, as Johnson had suspected, were letters, several pages of typewritten text, ostensibly from Sierra to her editor. Washington quickly looked through them. They were true. Sierra supposedly wrote about her plan to use Tavon for investigative journalism, calling him a primitive creature and a useful idiot, telling him how easy it had been to get him to believe in her love. The detective carefully packed the letters in an evidence bag. Forensics would show them to be fake, but that would be secondary. What mattered was the motive they created. The next stop was the technical bay. Washington had no illusions that he would voluntarily gain access to classified records, but he had a backup plan. An hour before arriving at the prison, he contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation and anonymously provided them with information about possible crimes at Riverdale Prison, including experiments on inmates. It was a risky move, but the only one possible in his position. Now he had to buy time. Washington had requested records of all of Sierra and Tavon's phone calls, though he wasn't really interested in them. While the prison staff searched for and copied the records, the detective discreetly sent a message to his FBI contact, Tech Bay, server in secure room, secret recordings. He then returned to Hawkins' office to continue the game. "Find anything interesting, detective?" the warden asked with feigned curiosity. "Perhaps," Washington replied. Those letters found in McKinley's cell seemed to be the cause of his rage. If he believed his wife had been using him all this time. "The motive is clear," Hawkins nodded. "Well, I'm glad we've cleared that up. I suppose you can close the case now?" "Almost," Washington said. "All that's left is to listen to the phone records, and if possible, I'd like to have another conversation with Guard Morrison." Hawkins frowned. "Unfortunately, Morrison is off duty today. Family emergency." "I see," the detective nodded. "Then I'll just wait for the results of the examination of the letters." At that moment, there was a knock at the office. A worried security guard entered. "Sir, there are FBI agents in there. They've served a search warrant for the technical bay and all computer systems." Hawkins' face changed, the calm mask slipping away to reveal anger and fear. "What? On what grounds?" The guard held out a piece of paper. "Suspicion of violating federal prisoner rights laws and illegal medical experimentation, sir." Hawkins looked at Washington, and the detective saw understanding in his eyes. "Did you?" he began, but stopped short. Quickly pulling himself together, he turned to the guard. "Show the agents to my office. I'll talk to them myself." When the guard left, Hawkins looked at Washington again. "Do you realize what you've done, detective? You broke the rules of the game." "I follow the law," Washington replied. "The real law, not your twisted rules." "The law," Hawkins sneered contemptuously. "The law is a tool in the hands of power. Today it's on your side, tomorrow it's on mine. But the system always remains." In his eyes, Washington saw not fear of arrest or punishment, but irritation at the temporary setback. It was as if Hawkins knew that somehow he would pull through, that he had patrons who would not let him fall. An hour later, the tech bay was sealed off by FBI agents, and the computers were seized as evidence. Among the files found on the secret server was an audio recording from the visiting room, complete, uncut, including the words of Morrison's security guard to Tavon just before the murder. "Remember our conversation. If you don't do this now, your mother and children won't live to see tonight. They are under surveillance right now. Take action. Dexter Hawkins was arrested on charges of orchestrated murder, corruption, extortion, and prisoner rights violations. James Morrison, apprehended at the airport while trying to leave the country, confessed to everything in exchange for a reduced sentence. Taven McKinley, thanks to disclosures, had the charge reclassified from premeditated murder to manslaughter, based on coercion and threats. Detective Lethral Washington stood at the window in his office, looking out over the rainy city victory, left a bitter taste. Yes, Hawkins had been arrested. His scheme destroyed. The guilty would be punished, but Ciara was dead. Taven would spend at least another 10 years in prison. Their children would be orphans. And most importantly, the system remains the same. Another warden will take Hawkins' place. Other schemes will be set up. Other inmates will be victimized. Because the system didn't break, it worked exactly as it was designed to work. It had always assumed the existence of people who had no choice. A phone call brought him out of his reverie. "Detective Washington," he answered. "Lathrell, it's Harris." The lieutenant's voice sounded strangely strained. "You've made some serious enemies with this case. There was a call from upstairs, very high up. They wanted to know who authorized you to bring in the FBI. I was following the law," Washington replied. "The law," Harris sighed. "Yes, technically you're right. But there's politics. There are unspoken rules. I can't cover for you forever." "I know," the detective said. "I'm not asking you to." After the conversation, Washington sat for a long time looking at Ciara Jackson's picture in the file. A young woman with intelligent eyes and a determined expression. She believed she could change the system. She'd given her life for it. He remembered Taven's words during their last meeting after Hawkins's arrest. "You know, Detective, for a moment I actually believed she loved me. For the first time in years I felt like someone cared. And then they showed me those letters, and I felt so stupid, so worthless." "They were forgeries, Taven," Washington replied then. "She didn't write those. What difference does it make?" McKinley shrugged his shoulders. "After all, she was using me anyway. Maybe not as brutally as it was written, but she used me. I was a tool for her, not a person, just like I was to everyone else." And Washington couldn't find anything to say in response, because deep down, he knew Taven was right. The system turns people into tools, prisoners, guards, even journalists and police officers. Everyone plays their part, and no one can break out of the cycle. But sometimes, very rarely, someone finds the strength to defy the system. Like Ciara, like himself. And even though these attempts are rarely completely successful, they remind everyone else that there is a choice after all. Even if it's a choice between bad and very bad. Even if the cost is prohibitive, the detective closed the case file and stamped "closed." Another investigation completed. One more small battle in the never-ending war for justice. Impossible to win, but impossible to give up. The rain intensified, drumming on the glass, washing the mud off the city streets. But Washington knew that even the heaviest downpour couldn't truly clean up the system. It would take something more than that. And perhaps that something had not yet been invented by humans.